Hi, Women of Welcome. I'm Sarah Casada, back today on video to address some of our frequently asked questions that we receive both here in the group, but also on our public page. Today I want to talk about our U.S. asylum process because it has been a huge topic of conversation, particularly over the last year or two, as we've seen asylum seekers increase at the border. And it feels like it's a part of the immigration system that was not talked about all that often beforehand. And so for many of us, it's been a learning process, myself included. I have notes today because I want to make sure I get everything as right as I can to keep you updated, because this is a really interesting and kind of maybe tricky is the right word, part of our immigration system, particularly for those of us who are people of faith and who want to provide a safe place for people who are in danger and in need. And that is the goal of our U.S. asylum process. This process was created after World War II, when the U.S. had turned back Jewish refugees and returned them to Europe where they were in significant danger. And we said that that was something that we never wanted to do again. And so we created our asylum process with the explicit goal of trying to make sure that the U.S. had a way for people who needed a safe place for refuge to be able to come. And so who qualifies for asylum? There's three things you need in order to qualify. One, you must have already reached the U.S. You cannot apply for asylum outside of the United States. You have to be on U.S. soil to apply. So that's the first criteria. Secondly, you must have a credible fear that is based on one of these five characteristics: race, religion, political opinion, national origin, or social group. I'll say those again: race, religion, political opinion, national origin, or social group. So you have to be in danger because you fall into, because of one of those five reasons. And then the third qualification that you must have to qualify for asylum is documented evidence that you can make a case that your life is in danger because of those reasons. So that is who qualifies. And then there's a little bit of a different process for how people apply than for some of the other avenues for legal immigration. I do want to just clarify, because there's been a lot of misinformation. Seeking asylum is a legal pathway to legal immigration. I talked in my last video about the blood, sweat, and tears. And so this is part of that tears pathway, is our asylum process. So that is a legal pathway for immigration. And you can apply if you are already in the US. And typically if you've been here less than a year and you want to apply for asylum, you can go ahead and initiate that process where you will be submit an application, be interviewed, and they will make a decision about whether or not you qualify for asylum. If you're approved, you'll get all your documentation for being able to stay for that reason. If you are not approved for asylum and you're here on a legal visa, you still have legal status, then you will need to leave at the end of that. And if you had already, whether overstayed a visa or entered illegally, then you would be subject to removal at that point. However, there are a lot of people who apply right as they enter the US. And so that's whether they arrive by airplane or arrive by land. And so if someone arrives to the US, so they've met that first criteria, they reached US soil, and they want to apply for asylum, they would approach an officer and let them know, I want to apply for asylum. A couple of things happen at that point. It's possible, and very likely actually, that they'll be detained briefly once they acknowledge that they have arrived and want to seek asylum. Then they will be offered what's called a credible fear interview. And so that is a process that people go through, where someone basically is doing an initial screening to see, is it likely that this person would qualify for asylum? And once they determine that yes, they will, that person is then issued a court date. They can be detained between that time that they pass the interview up until that court date. That has been the current kind of general operating procedure. In the past, They have also made decisions to release asylum seekers with the ankle bracelets for instead of keeping them in detention. It's a more affordable option. And asylum seekers have a really high rate of showing up for court. I believe it's in the 90th percentile because this is a legal pathway to immigration and people want legal status. And so if they believe that they qualify, they're walking through that process. So then once someone goes to court, they go through that process. Sometimes there's appeals and different things along the way, but that's where they really find out if they will be offered asylum status or if they will not. A couple of things have changed in recent years that have made not only this, it's just made it more complicated. Let me say it like that. So a couple of things have changed. One, that classification that I mentioned, social group, was redefined recently to eliminate any kind of private violence, which includes gang violence and domestic violence. And so that was a big shift where that had previously been determined that if someone felt that their life was in danger because of gang violence, they could make a case that they needed asylum and stay here in the United States. That has changed, and that changed when Jeff Sessions was Attorney General. And the other things that have changed, again, as I mentioned, people have to be on US soil to be able to seek asylum. And so something that changed at our southern border was a process called metering, which was officials actually meeting migrants before they arrived at the US border and turning them away so that they could not reach the US to claim asylum. They started saying that they would take a certain number of asylum seekers a day and limiting how many people could claim asylum and telling them that they had to wait their turn. So that was a big change, as well as we started what was called the Migrant Protection Protocol, MPP, or it's more commonly known as Remain in Mexico. So you remember that I said if you come by land and you go and claim asylum, I do want to point out you may claim asylum at a legal port of entry, or you may claim asylum even if you have entered illegally. So one of the things that happened as we started metering at our points of entry was that more and more people started going in between ports of entry, crossing the border, and then submitting their asylum claim that way because they were able to do that more quickly. Because some people are waiting months in Mexico to be able to go up just to claim asylum. So then the Remain in Mexico policy meant that once they went through that credible fear interview and they were issued a court date, they were told to remain in Mexico to wait for that court date. This has created a bunch of challenges in Mexico, as you might imagine, because what a lot of times would happen in the US when we decided to release people with the ankle monitors is they would go to a family member's house to wait for their court date. But people aren't able to reach those family members now, so they're really waiting in migrant camps on the Mexican side of the border, churches offering hospitality, shelters, that kind of thing, waiting for their court dates. It also makes it much, much, much more difficult for lawyers to support those migrants because of the just going back and forth across the border, and people have been harder to find because they are moving around even within Mexico. So that was another big change. And then the third thing that happened just this past summer in July was a change in our policy that said you would need to, if you crossed over any other country between your home country and the US, you would need to apply for asylum there first, be denied, and then you could continue up to the US. So considering that our predominant surge of asylum seekers in the last few years have been from Central America, or what we call the Northern Triangle, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, this essentially eliminates all of those folks from being allowed right now to apply for asylum. They would essentially have to apply. So folks in El Salvador pass through Guatemala, then they pass through Mexico before they reach the US. So they would have to apply in Guatemala, be denied, go to Mexico, apply and be denied, and then they could come to the US. So those are some of the changes that have recently occurred in our asylum process. So you'll see right now different headlines saying that those applications are dropping, and it's because of those changes. It's not necessarily because people aren't still in danger and looking for a safe place to land, but it's because we're changing the laws in such a way that people no longer are able to apply, whether that's because the reason they're in danger is because of gang violence or because they've passed through other countries first, all of those reasons. So one of the questions that people often have, especially with this rise in applications over the last couple of years, is, are people taking advantage of this process? And one of the things that we can say to that is the reality that just because someone is denied asylum doesn't necessarily mean that their life was in danger or life wasn't in danger or that they were taking advantage of the process. There's a lot of misunderstanding about what qualifies people for asylum and if they actually have a case. And so just because someone is going through that process and doesn't get accepted doesn't mean that they don't feel in danger and we're legitimately seeking that safety, but they may not realize that they don't qualify. For example, if they feel in danger because of gang violence, those laws may have changed in the time that they made the decision to flee and the time that they are going through this process. So there's also a reality that some people may qualify, they may have legitimate fear because of one of the 5 reasons that we mentioned, but they may not have documentation for it. And so it is a complicated process for people to win, and it's increasingly made so because so few people have lawyers in that process. And you know, I'm always reminded of how confusing and complicated our immigration system can be to me at different times, especially as laws keep changing. And that's true for migrants as well who are trying to navigate that system. And so there is a lot of factors that go into why people are seeking refuge and seeking to apply for asylum through this process. So I hope this has helped understand a little bit of that process. And I will save this video in our files section here in the group so that you can have access to this both in video but also in writing. Have a great day.